Hey boys, look at this crippled old-timer trying to park. Somebody should put him out of his misery. The words cut through the humid Virginia afternoon like a knife through silence. Cleet Brunner stood with his boots planted wide on the cracked asphalt of Mabel's highway diner, a cigarette dangling from his lip and a sneer carved into his weathered face. His leather vest bore patches he had not earned and symbols he did not understand, and his voice carried the particular cruelty of a man who had spent his whole life looking for someone weaker to stand above. The beat-up Ford pickup had pulled into the handicap spot with the careful precision of someone who had learned to compensate for limitations. The engine rattled twice before falling silent, and through the dusty windshield, the outline of an old man could be seen gathering himself for the simple act of exiting his vehicle. 7 Harley-Davidson motorcycles sat illegally sprawled across 3 parking spaces, their chrome catching the afternoon sun. The 6 men lounging around them passed a cooler of beer between them despite the posted signs prohibiting alcohol on the premises. They had been there for an hour, and in that hour, 3 families had chosen to keep driving rather than stop. The driver's door of the pickup creaked open, and a worn boot emerged first. Then came the prosthetic leg, the metal and polymer catching the light as the old man swung it out and planted on the ground. He was 71 years old, though the years sat on him like centuries. His face was weathered by sun and time and things that sun and time could not explain. A white beard covered his jaw, neatly trimmed in the way of a man who still maintained standards even when no one was watching. His navy ball cap was faded to a color that had no name, and on his denim jacket, barely visible beneath the wear, sat a patch that most people would never recognize. The trident, worn almost to nothing. But there, Earl Whitmore reached back into the cab and retrieved his cane, a simple aluminum thing with a rubber grip that had been replaced twice. He closed the door with his hip and stood for a moment, surveying the scene before him with eyes that had seen far worse than a pack of weekend outlaws playing dress-up. One of Cleet's men, a heavy-set biker with a braided beard, pointed at the prosthetic leg and laughed. "Look at him go, like a broken wind-up toy." Another chimed in. "Maybe he's looking for the pawn shop. Probably wants to sell that fake leg for beer money." Earl said nothing. He adjusted his cap with one hand and began his slow, deliberate walk toward the diner entrance. Each step was measured and precise, the cane touching ground at exactly the right moment, his body moving with an economy of motion that spoke of decades of training even as it compensated for what had been taken from him. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and the cool air conditioning washed over him like a blessing. Mabel's highway diner had not changed in the 40 years Earl had been coming here. The chrome counter still gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The red vinyl booze still bore the cracks and repairs of 1,000 travelers. The smell of coffee and bacon grease still hung in the air like a permanent resident. Mabel herself stood behind the counter, 78 years old and still working 6 days a week because she did not know any other way to live. She saw Earl and smiled, already reaching for the coffee pot. The diner was half full. 2 truckers sat at the counter, their rigs visible through the window. A young family occupied a booth near the back, the father trying to keep 2 children under 10 entertained with crayons and paper placemats. A couple in their 60s shared a slice of pie near the window, and in the corner, at a table positioned with clear sight lines to both the front door and the emergency exit, sat 4 men. They wore civilian clothes, but everything else about them screamed military. The haircuts, the posture, the way they ate with efficient purpose rather than leisure. The way their eyes tracked movement without appearing to watch anything at all. They were young, most of them late 20s to mid-30s, with the kind of physical presence that came from years of training designed to break ordinary men. One of them had a thick beard, dark with streaks of premature gray, and eyes that held the particular stillness of someone who had seen violence and made peace with it. His gaze followed Earl as the old man made his way to his usual booth by the window, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of it. Earl settled into the cracked vinyl seat, his back to the wall, his eyes on the door. Mabel appeared with coffee before he could ask, setting the cup down with the familiarity of ritual. "The usual, Earl," she said. It was not a question. He nodded, and she disappeared back toward the kitchen. Outside, the bikers had finished their beers and were growing restless. Cleet Brunner stubbed out his cigarette on the asphalt and jerked his head toward the diner. His crew fell in behind him like wolves following the pack leader, and the bell above the door announced their entrance with a cheerful chime that seemed to mock what was about to unfold. Earl lifted his coffee cup and took a slow sip. His hand was steady. His breathing was even. He had faced far worse than this in places these men would never know existed. But he also knew what they did not. In exactly 20 minutes, these men would learn why you never judge a warrior by his wounds. They would learn that the most dangerous man in any room is often the one who appears to have nothing left to lose. And they would learn that there are some veterans whose service never truly ends, whose brotherhood stretches across generations, and whose quiet dignity can summon thunder. The bikers spread out across the diner like an oil spill, their voices too loud, their presence designed to intimidate. And somewhere in this moment, a story began that would remind the world of a simple truth. Not all heroes wear their medals where you can see them. Now, before we continue this story, we would love to know where you are watching from today. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And think about this as you watch. There might be a quiet veteran in your own community, someone whose humble appearance hides decades of service and sacrifice, someone whose scars tell stories that most of us will never fully understand. If you know someone like that, this story is for them. And if stories like this one speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel so you never miss another one. Now, let us continue. The coffee was the same as it had been for 40 years. Strong enough to strip paint, Vince used to say, black as midnight and twice as bitter. Earl held the cup between his palms and let the warmth seep into fingers that ached more with each passing winter. Saturday mornings had become a ritual so ingrained that Earl no longer thought about the steps. He simply followed them the way his body had once followed patrol routes through hostile territory. Wake at 0500. Shower and shave with military precision. Drive 30 miles to the Veterans Cemetery outside Richmond. Stand before the headstone that bore the name Vincent Michael Thibodeau, Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, beloved friend and brother in arms. This morning had been no different. Earl had stood in the wet grass as the sun climbed over the rows of white stones, each one representing a story that most Americans would never know. He had spoken to Vince the way he always did, updating him on small things that did not matter and large things that mattered too much. They promoted Riley to Master Chief. Earl had said to the granite, "You remember Riley, the kid who cried during Hell Week and then finished first in his class. He is running the training program now, making them harder than we ever were." The stone had not answered, but Earl had not expected it to. He had learned long ago that conversations with the dead were not about receiving responses. They were about maintaining connection, about refusing to let go of the men who had shaped you into something worth being. Now Earl sat in the booth where he and Vince had stopped 100 times over 3 decades. The seat across from him was empty, as it had been for 18 years. Sometimes Earl still expected to look up and see his friend sliding into that cracked vinyl seat, grinning that Louisiana grin, complaining about the coffee while drinking 3 cups of it. Vince had been the better operator. Everyone who served with him knew it. Earl had the instincts, the navigation skills that earned him his call sign, but Vince had possessed something rarer. He could read people the way Earl could read terrain. He knew when a source was lying before the words left their mouth. He could walk into a village and know within 30 seconds who was friendly, who was hostile, and who was simply trying to survive. They had met in 1980, 2 young men with something to prove and nothing to lose. Bud/S Class 116. They had suffered through Hell Week together, had watched 18 of their classmates ring the bell and walk away, had emerged on the other side as brothers in a way that blood could never match. For the next 26 years, they had operated side by side across every theater the Navy saw fit to send them. Grenada in 1983, when they were still young enough to believe they were invincible. Panama in 1989, when they learned they were not. Desert Storm, where the desert had tried to kill them in ways the enemy never could. And then the long years after, the missions that did not officially exist, the operations that would never appear in any history book. Earl reached into the inside pocket of his denim jacket and withdrew a photograph, so worn that the edges had gone soft as cloth. Two young men in jungle camouflage, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grins splitting their faces. Grenada, October 1983. They had been 29 years old and certain that they would live forever. He traced his thumb across Vince's face, across the smile that had never dimmed even in the darkest moments. The day that changed everything had been June 14th, 2006. Ramadi. They had been too old for direct action by then, both of them pushing 52, but the teams were stretched thin and experience mattered more than youth in certain situations. An intelligence source had requested extraction, and Earl and Vince had been tapped to bring him out. The first IED had detonated as they approached the safe house. Earl had taken shrapnel to his shoulder, a hot spray of metal that had shredded his sleeve and painted his arm red. Vince had been hit in the abdomen, a wound that both of them knew was fatal even as Earl hauled him over his shoulders and began the 300-meter trek to the extraction point. He could still feel the weight of Vince's body, could still hear the wet rasp of his breathing, could still smell the copper tang of blood mixing with the dust of that Iraqi street. The second IED had been buried 20 meters from safety. Earl had seen the disturbed earth a fraction of a second before the blast, had tried to turn his body to shield Vince, had felt the world come apart in fire and noise and pain. He had woken in a field hospital with his left leg gone below the knee and his best friend dead. Vince's last words still echoed in Earl's memory, as clear as the day they had been spoken. "You got me out, Compass. That is all that matters." But it was not all that mattered. It had never been all that mattered, because Earl was still here drinking coffee in this diner, and Vince was not. Because Earl had a prosthetic leg that ached when the weather changed, and Vince had a headstone that collected fallen leaves each autumn. Because survival, Earl had learned, was its own kind of wound. He slipped the photograph back into his pocket and picked up his coffee cup. The seat across from him remained empty. At the corner table, the bearded man with the gray-streaked beard was watching Earl with an expression of growing curiosity. There was something about the old man's bearing that did not match his appearance. The way he held his coffee cup, the way his eyes tracked the room without appearing to move, the way he sat with his back to the wall and his dominant hand free. The bearded man had seen that posture before, had been trained to adopt it himself, had learned it from instructors who had learned it from the men who came before them. He leaned toward his teammates and spoke in a voice too low to carry. "That old man in the booth. Watch how he moves. Watch his eyes." His teammates glanced over, saw nothing but a tired old veteran nursing a cup of coffee, and shrugged. But the bearded man kept watching, because he had learned long ago that the most dangerous operators were the ones you never saw coming. And something about the old man in the faded navy cap was setting off alarms that 20 years of training had taught him never to ignore. The bikers moved through the diner like a disease spreading through healthy tissue. They were loud in the way that insecure men are loud, their voices pitched to dominate, their laughter sharp and mirthless. Cleet Brunner led them with the swagger of a man who had convinced himself that intimidation was the same as strength. He stopped at the booth where the young family sat. The father was perhaps 35, with the soft hands of someone who worked in an office and the nervous eyes of someone who had never learned to fight. His wife clutched their daughter close, a girl of maybe 6 with blonde pigtails and a crayon still gripped in her small fist. Their son, a few years older, stared at the bikers with the wide-eyed terror of a child confronting something he did not understand. Cleet planted his hands on the table and leaned down until his face was level with the father's. "This is our booth," he said. His breath smelled of cheap beer and cheaper cigarettes. "We sit here every time we come through. So you and your pretty little family are going to need to move." The father's voice came out thin and reedy. "We were here first. There are other booths available." Cleet's smile did not reach his eyes. "I was not asking." The mother pulled her children closer, her face pale. The little girl had begun to cry, soft, hiccuping sobs that she tried to muffle against her mother's shoulder. The boy sat frozen, his small hands clenched in a fist that would do nothing against grown men. Mabel emerged from behind the counter, her 78-year-old frame drawn up to its full height. "Now you listen here," she said. Her voice carried the authority of a woman who had been dealing with difficult customers since before these men were born. "This is my establishment, and I will not have you terrorizing my guests. You can take any empty booth you like, but you will leave this family alone." Cleet turned his attention to her, and his smile grew uglier. "Sit down, Grandma, before you break a hip." One of his crew laughed, a high-pitched sound that bounced off the chrome fixtures. Another made a crude gesture that set the rest of them cackling. Earl watched from his booth, his coffee cup suspended halfway between the table and his lips. His eyes had gone flat and cold, the way they always did when he was assessing a tactical situation. 7 hostiles, poorly coordinated, relying on intimidation rather than skill. Multiple civilians in potential crossfire. 2 exits, one blocked by the bikers near the front, one clear through the kitchen. The 4 men in the corner had shifted their posture, bodies angled toward the confrontation, weight balanced on the balls of their feet. The bearded one caught Earl's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod, a question and an offer wrapped in a single gesture. Earl responded with a slight shake of his head. Not yet. Mabel had not backed down. She stood with her hands on her hips, her jaw set in a line that had faced down rowdy truckers and handsy salesmen and every variety of trouble that wandered through her doors over 5 decades. "I'm calling the police," she said, "and you can explain yourselves to them." Cleet laughed. "Go ahead, sweetheart. Nearest station is 20 miles away. By the time they get here, we'll be long gone." He turned back to the family. "So what is it going to be, Dad? You going to make your kids watch you get embarrassed?" The father stood slowly, his hands raised in surrender. His wife gathered the children, the little girl still crying, the boy still frozen. They shuffled out of the booth and retreated toward the back of the diner, toward the elderly couple who made room for them with sympathetic murmurs. Cleet slid into the vacated booth with an exaggerated sigh of satisfaction. His crew piled in around him, their bulk straining the cracked vinyl seats. One of them snapped his fingers at Mabel. "Coffee, and make it fast." Mabel's hands trembled as she reached for the pot, but her face remained stone. She had survived worse than this. She had buried a husband and raised 3 children alone and kept this diner running through recessions and hurricanes and the slow death of the American highway. She would not give these men the satisfaction of seeing her break. Earl set his coffee cup down with a soft click. The sound should not have carried, but somehow it did. Somehow it cut through the noise and the laughter and the crying child. And for just a moment, Cleet Brunner looked up. Their eyes met across the diner. The old man in the faded navy cap and the biker in the leather vest covered in patches he had bought rather than earned. Something passed between them, a silent assessment, a weighing of threats. Cleet's lip curled. He had seen old men before, broken-down veterans who traded on their service for sympathy and handouts. Men who wore their military gear like costumes, trying to recapture glory days that had probably never existed. This one was no different. Just another crippled relic taking up space in a world that had moved on without him. He turned to his crew and jerked his chin toward Earl's booth. "Watch this," he said. "I'm going to have some fun with Grandpa over there." He rose from the booth and began walking toward Earl, his boots heavy on the linoleum floor. His crew watched with eager anticipation, hungry for entertainment, hungry for someone else's humiliation to make them feel bigger than they were. At the corner table, the bearded man tensed. His hand moved toward his phone, ready to dial a number that would bring down a particular kind of thunder. But he held off, watching, waiting to see how the old man would handle what was coming. Earl did not move. He did not tense or flinch or reach for his cane. He simply sat with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup and watched Cleet approach with the same calm he had once used to watch enemy combatants move through his scope at 800 meters. He had faced far worse than this, and something told him that before this afternoon was over, Cleet Brunner would understand exactly how badly he had miscalculated. Cleet Brunner stopped at the edge of Earl's booth and stood there for a moment, letting his shadow fall across the table. It was a technique he had perfected over years of bar fights and parking lot confrontations, a way of establishing dominance before a single word was spoken. He hooked his thumbs into his belt and looked down at the old man with an expression of theatrical contempt. Well, he said. What do we have here? Earl did not look up. He lifted his coffee cup and took a slow sip, as if the man looming over him was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. The gesture was deliberate, calibrated to communicate a complete absence of fear. It was the kind of thing that infuriated men like Cleet, and Earl knew it. I'm talking to you, old-timer. Cleet's voice rose a notch. You deaf as well as crippled? Just drinking my coffee, son. Earl's voice was quiet, unhurried, soft as worn leather. He set the cup down and finally raised his eyes to meet Cleet's. There was no challenge in his gaze, no aggression, just a calm, steady regard that seemed to look through Cleet rather than at him. The response threw Cleet off balance for just a moment. He had expected fear or anger, something he could push against. This quiet composure was harder to grip. He recovered by leaning closer, planting one hand on the table. So, he spat the word like it tasted bad. I am not your son, Grandpa, and I do not like the way you were looking at me earlier. Like you got something to say. Earl's expression did not change. I have got nothing to say to you. I would recommend you leave these people alone and go about your business. Cleet's crew had gathered behind him now, a wall of leather and denim and poorly concealed excitement. One of them, a younger man with a shaved head and a neck tattoo of a snake, pointed at Earl's navy cap. Hey, Cleet, check it out. We got ourselves a war hero. He drew out the last two words with mocking emphasis. Cleet's eyes went to the cap, then down to the faded patch on Earl's jacket. The trident. He did not recognize it for what it was. To him, it was just another piece of military costume, the kind of thing anyone could buy at an army surplus store. Oh, this is rich, Cleet said. He straightened up and addressed his crew over his shoulder. Boys, we got a genuine American hero here. Probably spent his whole service behind a desk counting paper clips, and now he wants to pretend he is Rambo. The laughter that followed was sharp and ugly. Earl absorbed it without reaction. His hands remained still on the table, his breathing even, his posture unchanged. Only someone who knew what to look for would have noticed the slight shift in his weight, the subtle repositioning that would allow him to move quickly if necessary. At the corner table, the bearded man had stopped eating entirely. He was staring at Earl with an intensity that made his teammates uncomfortable. One of them, a younger operator with a thick neck and cautious eyes, leaned over. What is it, Danny? What do you see? The bearded man did not answer immediately. His gaze had dropped to Earl's forearm, where the sleeve of his denim jacket had ridden up slightly as he reached for his coffee. There was something there, partially visible beneath the cuff. Dark lines against weathered skin. The edge of a tattoo. I'm not sure yet, the bearded man said. But something is not right. That old man is too calm. Back at Earl's booth, Cleet had noticed the prosthetic leg. He pointed at it with undisguised glee. Would you look at that? The Tin Man lost his leg. He crouched down to get a better look, his face splitting into a cruel grin. What happened, Gramps? L'un mauvais accident? Trip over your own walker? One of his crew laughed so hard he had to brace himself against a neighboring booth. Another slapped his thigh like he had just heard the funniest joke of his life. Earl looked down at his prosthetic leg, then back up at Cleet. His voice remained steady. Ramadi, June 2006. IED took it while I was carrying my best friend to extraction. Cleet's grin flickered for just a moment, something uncertain passing behind his eyes. Then he shook it off and stood back up. Sure it did. And I'm the President of the United States. He turned to his crew. You hear that, boys? He lost it in Iraq. Probably saw it in a movie once and decided to steal the story. The biker with the snake tattoo reached down and flicked Earl's navy cap off his head. It tumbled to the floor, revealing the silver hair beneath and the scar that ran from Earl's temple to his ear, a thin white line against weathered skin, the mark of a bullet that had come within a centimeter of ending his life in a Panamanian jungle 36 years ago. Cleet stared at the scar for a moment, then kicked the cap across the floor toward the door. Go fetch it, old man. Crawl if you have to. Earl did not move. His eyes followed the cab as it skidded to a stop near the entrance, then returned to Cleet. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Still quiet, still controlled, but underneath it now was something that had not been there before. Something cold. Pick up my cover and return it. That is your last chance to walk away from this. Cleet blinked. For just a moment, something in the old man's tone reached a primitive part of his brain, the part that recognized a predator's warning. But his ego was stronger than his instincts, and his crew was watching, and he could not back down now. He reached down and grabbed Earl's cane from where it rested against the booth. He held it up like a trophy, waving it in front of Earl's face. "What are you going to do without this, cripple? Going to hop after me?" The bearded man at the corner table stood so abruptly that his chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a gunshot. His 3 teammates rose with him, moving in unison, their bodies shifting into positions that spoke of training and purpose. And in that moment, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath. The 4 men moved through the diner with a fluid coordination that spoke of countless hours of training together. They did not rush, did not shout, did not make any of the theatrical gestures that Cleet and his crew relied upon. They simply flowed into position, filling the space between the bikers and the rest of the diner's occupants with quiet, purposeful menace. The bearded man took point, stopping 6 feet from where Cleet stood holding Earl's cane. His 3 teammates fanned out behind him, each one covering a different angle, each one watching a different cluster of bikers. It was a formation designed to control a room, and it worked. The bikers who had been lounging in the booth suddenly found themselves very aware of their own vulnerability. Cleet turned to face this new threat, his grip tightening on the cane. His crew shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado evaporating like morning fog under a harsh sun. They were accustomed to intimidating civilians, to facing opponents who backed down at the first sign of aggression. These 4 men were something else entirely. "Mind your business, pretty boy." Cleet's voice had lost some of its swagger. "This is between us and the cripple." The bearded man did not respond. He did not even look at Cleet. His eyes were fixed on Earl, studying him with an intensity that bordered on reverence. He took in the scar on the old man's temple, the weathered hands that rested motionless on the table, the faded trident patch that most people would never recognize, and the tattoo. Earl's sleeve had ridden up further during the confrontation, exposing more of the ink on his forearm. The bearded man could see it clearly now. Coordinates in precise military notation. A date. The trident, larger and more detailed than the patch on his jacket. And beneath it all, 2 initials rendered in a style that spoke of grief and permanence. Vete. The bearded man's face went pale. His breath caught in his throat. He had seen tattoos like this before, on the arms of men who had served in the Shadow Wars, who had lost brothers in places that did not officially exist. But the coordinates. He recognized those coordinates. Compass. The name came out like a prayer, like a word spoken in church. His voice cracked on the second syllable. Earl's eyes shifted to the younger man. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The diner had gone completely silent. Even the little girl had stopped crying, as if she sensed that something important was happening. "Do I know you, son?" Earl's voice was gentle now, the cold edge gone. The bearded man snapped to attention. It was not a casual gesture or a mocking imitation. It was the real thing, spine straight, chin up, eyes forward, rendered with the precision of someone who had spent years perfecting it. His 3 teammates followed suit without hesitation, their bodies moving in unison, their heels coming together with a sharp click. Cleet stared at them with his mouth hanging open. "What the hell is wrong with you people?" The bearded man ignored him completely. "Master Chief Earl Whitmore," he said. His voice carried through the silent diner, clear and strong despite the emotion that threatened to break it. "Call sign Compass. SEAL Team 6 Planconer. 34 years of service to the United States Navy." The words hit the room like a physical force. Mabel's hand went to her mouth. The truckers at the counter turned on their stools, their faces slack with shock. The father who had been forced from his booth stared at Earl with new eyes, understanding dawning slowly across his features. Cleet's crew had begun backing toward the door, their faces pale, their earlier cruelty forgotten in the face of something they did not understand but instinctively feared. The bearded man continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. This man trained my instructor. Every operator in the teams learned navigation from someone who learned it from him. He turned to his teammates. Jensen, your father served under him in Desert Storm. One of the younger men, a broad-shouldered operator with close-cropped hair, nodded slowly. My dad said Compass could find his way through a sandstorm blindfolded. Said he was the best navigator he ever served with. The bearded man turned back to Earl. Panama, Grenada, missions that do not officially exist. In Ramadi, he paused, his jaw tightening. June 14th, 2006. The day you lost your leg, saving Senior Chief Thibodeau. Earl's hand moved unconsciously to the tattoo on his forearm, his fingers tracing the initials there. Could not save him, he said quietly. Only carried him far enough to die in my arms. The bearded man shook his head. Sir, with respect, that is not how the story goes. You carried him 300 meters under fire. You took shrapnel in the shoulder and kept moving. You triggered a second IED 20 meters from extraction and still managed to shield him with your body. He paused, his voice dropping to something close to a whisper. You are why we train the way we do. Every SEAL who has gone through BUD/S in the last 18 years has heard your name. Earl said nothing. His eyes had gone distant, lost in memories of a dusty street and a dying friend and a world that had come apart in fire and blood. Cleet Brunner stood frozen, the cane still clutched in his hand, his face cycling through confusion and fear and the slow, dawning realization that he had made a terrible mistake. The leather vest with its unearned patches suddenly felt very heavy on his shoulders. The motorcycle club that had given him identity and purpose suddenly seemed very small. The bearded man finally turned to look at him, and there was nothing friendly in his eyes. You, he said, have made a very serious error in judgment. The silence that followed stretched like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Every person in that diner seemed frozen in place, caught in the aftermath of a revelation that had shifted the very air in the room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The coffee maker gurgled behind the counter. Outside, a truck rolled past on the highway, its driver oblivious to the drama unfolding within these walls. Cleet Brunner's face had gone the color of old ash. His fingers were still wrapped around Earl's cane, but the grip had loosened, as if the object had suddenly become too hot to hold. His crew had retreated to the far side of the diner, clustering near the door like animals sensing a storm. The bearded man took a step toward Cleet, and the biker flinched. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but everyone saw it. The predator had become prey, and he knew it. You came into this place, the bearded man said, and his voice was low and controlled in a way that was far more frightening than shouting would have been. You terrorized a family with small children. You disrespected a woman who has probably been serving travelers on this highway since before you were born. And then you decided to mock a man who has given more to this country than you could comprehend if you lived 1,000 years. Cleet opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat had constricted, his tongue had gone dry, and somewhere deep in his primitive brain, a voice was screaming at him to run. The bearded man continued. Do you know what that tattoo on his arm means? Those coordinates? He did not wait for an answer. That is where his best friend died. That is where he lost his leg. That is where he carried a dying man 300 meters through hostile fire, because that is what brothers do for each other. One of the younger SEALs, a man with a jaw like a granite cliff and eyes that had seen too much too young, spoke up. I studied that operation at officer training school. It is one of the most famous actions of the entire Iraq War. Master Chief Whitmore held his position under fire while bleeding out, refused evacuation until Senior Chief Thibodeau was loaded first. He paused, his voice thickening. They had to sedate him to get him on a helicopter. Earl sat motionless in his booth, his eyes fixed on some middle distance that only he could see. The memories were flooding back now, unstoppable as a tide. The weight of Vince on his shoulders. The crack of gunfire. the searing heat of the blast. The moment when he realized that the man he had carried through hell was no longer breathing. The little girl who had been crying earlier had broken free from her mother's grasp. She walked across the diner with the fearless curiosity of childhood, stopping beside Earl's booth. She looked up at him with wide eyes, then down at his prosthetic leg, then back up at his face. "Does it hurt?" she asked. Earl blinked, pulled back from his memories by the simple question. He looked down at the child, at her tear-streaked cheeks and her tangled pigtails and the crayon still clutched in her small fist. "Sometimes," he said softly, "but not as much as it used to." The girl nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her. Then she held out the crayon. It was blue, worn down to a nub. "You can have this," she said. "It is my favorite color. Maybe it will help." Earl reached out and took the crayon with the same care he might have used to accept a medal. "Thank you," he said. "I will keep it safe." The girl's mother had approached, her face a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. She put her hands on her daughter's shoulders and looked at Earl with eyes that glistened. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what they did to you, for what they said." Earl shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for, ma'am." The bearded man had not taken his eyes off Cleet. "The cane," he said. His voice left no room for negotiation. Cleet looked down at the cane as if he had forgotten he was holding it. His hand trembled as he extended it, offering it back to Earl like a supplicant presenting a gift to a king. The bearded man intercepted it. He took the cane and walked it over to Earl's booth, placing it gently against the seat within easy reach. Then he bent down and retrieved Earl's navy cap from where it had fallen near the door. He brushed it off with careful attention, removing the dust and grime, before carrying it back and setting it on the table in front of Earl. "Your cover, Master Chief." Earl looked at the cap, then up at the bearded man. There was something unspoken passing between them, a recognition that transcended rank and age and circumstance. Two warriors from different generations, connected by a brotherhood that civilians could never fully understand. "What is your name, son?" "Senior Chief Daniel Reeves, Master Chief." The bearded man's voice carried a note of pride. "I teach navigation at BUD/S now. I use your methods. Every instructor does." Earl nodded slowly. "Vince would have liked that," he said. "He always said the teams would outlast us all." At the door, Cleet's crew was growing restless. One of them, the youngest, had already slipped outside. The others were edging toward the exit, eager to escape a situation that had spiraled far beyond their control. But Cleet remained rooted in place, his face a battlefield of shame and fear and something that might have been the first stirrings of genuine remorse. The bearded man turned back to face him, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the room. "We're not done with you yet." Daniel Reeves crossed the diner floor with the deliberate pace of a man who had all the time in the world. His boots made no sound on the linoleum. His hands hung loose at his sides. Everything about his posture communicated controlled lethality, the kind that came from years of training designed to transform ordinary men into instruments of precision violence. Cleet Brunner watched him approach and felt something he had not experienced in decades. Pure, undiluted fear. Not the theatrical fear he performed for his crew, not the manufactured menace he used to intimidate civilians. This was the real thing, primal and overwhelming, the ancient recognition of a predator in the presence of something higher on the food chain. "You have a choice to make," Daniel said. He stopped close enough that Cleet could smell the coffee on his breath. "You can walk out that door right now, get on your motorcycle, and ride away. You can spend the rest of your life knowing what you did here today and hoping you never cross paths with anyone who heard about it." Cleet's throat worked, but no sound emerged. Or, Daniel continued, "You can stay. You can apologize to Master Chief Whitmore. You can apologize to Mabel for the way you spoke to her. You can apologize to that family for terrorizing their children. And then you can explain to me exactly what gives you the right to wear those patches on your vest." The words landed like physical blows. Cleet's hand moved instinctively to the patches on his leather vest, the symbols he had collected over years of riding with the Iron Reapers. Symbols of a brotherhood he had convinced himself was meaningful. Symbols that now felt like costume jewelry in the presence of men who had earned their insignias in blood. I served, Cleet said. His voice came out thin and defensive. Army. I was in the army. Daniel's eyes narrowed. How long? The question hung in the air like a blade. Cleet's crew had gone completely silent, watching from near the door with expressions of growing unease. They knew the answer. They had heard Cleet tell his war stories 100 times, stories that grew more elaborate with each telling, stories that had transformed 2 weeks of basic training into years of imagined combat. 2 weeks, Cleet said finally. The words seemed to cost him something vital. I washed out of basic. The admission echoed through the diner. One of his crew, the man with the snake tattoo on his neck, made a sound of disgust and pushed through the door into the parking lot. Another followed, then another. Within moments, only 2 of the original 7 remained, and they looked like they were reconsidering their life choices. Daniel nodded slowly. 2 weeks. And on the basis of 2 weeks, you decided you had the right to mock a man who gave 34 years, who lost his leg in combat, who carried his dying best friend through enemy fire. Cleet said nothing. His eyes had dropped to the floor, unable to meet Daniel's gaze. At his booth, Earl had been watching the exchange in silence. The little girl's blue crayon was still clutched in his hand, a small spot of color against the weathered brown of his skin. He thought about all the young men he had trained over the years, all the recruits who had come to Coronado thinking they knew what strength was, thinking they understood sacrifice. Most of them learned. Some of them did not. The ones who washed out were not failures, not really. Bud/S was designed to find the men who belonged in the teams, and belonging was not about physical strength or mental toughness alone. It was about something deeper, something that could not be taught or faked. The man standing before Daniel Reeves had never learned that lesson. He had spent his whole life pretending to be something he was not, building an identity out of leather and chrome and intimidation, because he had never discovered who he actually was. Earl cleared his throat. The sound was soft, but it cut through the tension like a knife. Daniel, he said. The bearded seal turned. Master Chief, let him go. The word surprised everyone, including Cleet. Daniel's brow furrowed. Sir, with respect, this man deserves to face consequences for what he did. Earl picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip. The coffee had gone cold, but he drank it anyway. He does, Earl agreed, but not from us. He set the cup down and looked directly at Cleet for the first time since the confrontation had begun. The consequences he faces are his own. He has to live with who he is. He has to look in a mirror every morning and see a man who terrorizes families and mocks wounded veterans because it makes him feel powerful. Cleet flinched as if struck. Earl continued, his voice steady and quiet. That is a punishment worse than anything we could do to him, because deep down, he knows the truth. He knows that everything he pretends to be is a lie, and lies like that have a way of eating a man alive from the inside out. The diner had gone completely still. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade, leaving only Earl's voice and the weight of his words. So let him go, Earl said. Let him ride away with his friends who are abandoning him. Let him spend the rest of his life knowing that when he was tested, really tested, he failed. That is justice enough. Daniel held Earl's gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He stepped aside, clearing a path to the door. Cleet did not move. His face had crumpled into something raw and broken, the mask of bravado stripped away to reveal the frightened man beneath. Tears were forming in the corners of his eyes, though he fought to hold them back. I am sorry, he whispered. The words were barely audible. I am so sorry. Earl nodded once. Then go, and do better. Cleet Brunner walked toward the door on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Each step was an effort, a conscious decision to keep moving forward when every instinct screamed at him to collapse. His remaining crew members had already fled to the parking lot, and through the window he could see them straddling their motorcycles, engines rumbling with impatience. He paused at the door, his hand on the glass. For a moment he stood there, silhouetted against the afternoon sun, a man caught between the person he had been and whatever he might become. Then he pushed through and was gone, the bell above the door chiming with cheerful indifference to the drama that had just concluded. The roar of motorcycle engines filled the parking lot. One by one, the Harleys peeled out onto the highway, their riders hunched over handlebars, faces hidden behind dark visors. Within moments, the sound had faded to a distant growl, then to nothing at all. Inside the diner, no one spoke. The silence that followed was different from the tense quiet that had preceded the confrontation. This was a contemplative stillness, the kind that settles over a space when something significant has occurred. Mabel was the first to move. She picked up the coffee pot and walked to Earl's booth, refilling his cup with hands that had finally stopped trembling. "On the house," she said. "Forever. Every cup you ever drink in this place, until the day I close these doors for good." Earl looked up at her with a soft smile. "That is not necessary, Mabel. It is necessary to me." Her voice was firm. "I have been running this diner for 53 years. I've seen a lot of things. Good things and bad things and everything in between. But I have never seen anything like what just happened." She paused, her eyes glistening. "And I have never been more proud to serve someone." She squeezed his shoulder once, gently, then retreated back behind the counter. The other customers had begun to stir, breaking free from the spell that had held them. The truckers returned to their meals, though they kept glancing over at Earl's booth with expressions of quiet awe. The elderly couple near the window dabbed at their eyes with napkins. The young father approached Earl's table, his wife and children close behind. The boy who had been frozen with fear was looking at Earl differently now, his eyes wide with wonder rather than terror. "Sir," the father said. His voice was thick with emotion. "I do not know how to thank you. What you did, what you said." He shook his head, unable to find the right words. Earl gestured to the booth across from him. "Sit down. All of you." The family slid into the seat, the children wedged between their parents. Earl looked at each of them in turn, then settled his gaze on the father. "What is your name, son?" "Thomas. Thomas Mercer. This is my wife, Sarah, and our children, Emma and Jacob." Earl nodded. "Thomas, let me tell you something. What happened here today was not about me. It was not about what I did or did not do 30 years ago. It was about who those men chose to be in this moment." He leaned forward slightly. "And it was about who you chose to be." Thomas's brow furrowed. "I did not do anything. I backed down. I let them take our table." "You protected your family," Earl said. "You looked at the situation, you assessed the threat, and you made the decision that kept your wife and children safe. That is not cowardice. That is wisdom." Sarah Mercer reached across the table and touched Earl's hand. The gesture was brief, almost shy, but it carried a weight of gratitude that words could not express. The little girl, Emma, had been watching Earl with the intense focus of childhood. She pointed at his prosthetic leg. "My grandpa has one of those," she said. "He lost his leg too." Earl smiled. "Is that so?" Emma nodded solemnly. "He stepped on a bomb in Vietnam. He does not like to talk about it." Earl's smile softened into something more complex. "A lot of us do not like to talk about it," he said. "Sometimes the things we carry are too heavy for words." Daniel Reeves and his teammates had remained standing throughout the exchange, maintaining a respectful distance while staying alert to any potential threat. But now Daniel approached the booth, his posture relaxed for the first time since the confrontation began. "Master Chief," he said, "if you do not mind, my team and I would be honored to join you. We have had a lot of questions, and the drive back to Norfolk can wait." Earl considered this for a moment, then nodded. The Mercer family took this as their cue to leave, gathering their children with murmured thanks and promises to never forget this day. Thomas shook Earl's hand one final time, gripping it with both of his own. "If there is ever anything I can do for you," he said, "anything at all, you let me know." Earl watched them walk back to their original booth, the children chattering excitedly, the parents exchanging looks of profound relief. Then he turned his attention to the 4 SEALs who were settling into the seats around him. For the first time in 18 years, the seat across from Earl Whitmore was not empty. Daniel Reeves sat directly opposite, his gray-streaked beard catching the afternoon light that streamed through the window. His teammates arranged themselves around the booth, their large frames making the space feel crowded in a way that was somehow comforting. So Daniel said, "Tell us about Compass. Tell us how you earned that call sign." Earl picked up his coffee cup, the warmth seeping into his weathered hands. He took a sip, set it down, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he began to talk. The story began in 1983, in a jungle that no longer exists on any official map. Earl's voice was low and steady, the cadence of a man who had learned to measure his words the way a sniper measures distance. Grenada. Operation Urgent Fury. We were tasked with extracting a CIA asset who had gotten himself trapped behind enemy lines. Bad intelligence, worse weather, and a timeline that gave us no room for error. The four SEALs listened in absolute silence. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its slow descent toward the Virginia hills, painting the diner in shades of gold and amber. Mabel had refilled their coffee cups twice without being asked, moving through the space like a ghost, unwilling to disturb the sacred act of storytelling. "We inserted by helicopter 12 miles from the target," Earl continued. "Dense jungle, no trails, and our maps were useless. The terrain had changed since the survey photos were taken. Our team leader wanted to abort, call for extraction, try again when we had better intel." Daniel leaned forward. "But you did not abort." Earl shook his head. "I told him I could get us there. No compass, no GPS, nothing but the stars and the shape of the land." He paused, his eyes going distant. "Vince backed me up. He always did. Told the team leader that if Whitmore said he could navigate blind, then Whitmore could navigate blind." The name hung in the air between them. Vince, the man whose initials were inked permanently into Earl's forearm, whose dog tags rested against Earl's chest beneath his shirt, whose absence had defined Earl's life for 18 years. "We made it," Earl said. 11 miles through jungle that should have been impassable, arrived at the extraction point with 4 minutes to spare. The asset was alive. We got him out. After that, the call sign stuck. Compass, the man who could find his way through anything. Jensen, the young SEAL whose father had served with Earl, spoke up. "My dad said you navigated a sandstorm and desert storm. Said the whole convoy would have been lost without you." Earl allowed himself a small smile. "That was a different kind of navigation. Sand plays tricks on your eyes, makes you see things that are not there. But the principles are the same. Trust the land. Trust your training. Trust the men beside you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the photograph, the one he had carried for 40 years. He laid it on the table, smoothing the worn edges with gentle fingers. Two young men in jungle camouflage, arms around each other, grins splitting their faces. "That is Vince," he said. "Vincent Michael Thibodeau, Senior Chief. Best operator I ever served with. Best friend I ever had." Daniel picked up the photograph with reverent care. He studied the two young faces, tried to reconcile them with the weathered old man sitting across from him. The years between that photo and this moment contained more history than most people could imagine. "We came up together," Earl said. "Bud/S Class 116. Hell Week nearly killed us both, but we made it through by carrying each other. That is how it worked with us. When one was weak, the other was strong. When one faltered, the other held the line." He took back the photograph and slipped it into his pocket, close to his heart where it had lived for decades. "After Grenada, we were inseparable. Every deployment, every mission, every operation that the Navy saw fit to send us on. Panama in 1989, where a bullet grazed my head and Vince dragged me to cover. Desert Storm, where we spent 3 weeks behind enemy lines gathering intelligence. And then all the missions that never officially happened, the ones that exist only in classified files and the memories of the men who were there." The diner had grown quieter as Earl spoke. The truckers had finished their meals but lingered over cold coffee, pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. The elderly couple had abandoned all pretense, openly watching the conversation with tears streaming down their faces. Earl's voice dropped lower. "June 14th, 2006. Ramadi. We were too old for direct action, both of us. 52 years old, bodies held together by scar tissue and stubbornness. But the teams were stretched thin, and experience counts for something in situations where everything can go wrong. He paused, his hand moving unconsciously to his prosthetic leg. The source was good. The intelligence was solid. What we did not know was that the safe house had been compromised. They were waiting for us. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had read the after-action reports, had studied the mission at officer training school, but hearing it from a man who had lived it was something else entirely. First IED took out our vehicle, Earl continued. I caught shrapnel in the shoulder, tore through the muscle like paper. Vince took the worst of it. Abdominal wound. We both knew what that meant, but neither of us said it out loud. He looked down at his coffee cup, at the dark liquid that reflected the fading afternoon light. I put him on my shoulders, and I started walking. 300 meters to the extraction point. Longest 300 meters of my life. He was talking the whole way, telling me jokes, telling me about the fishing trip he was going to take when we got home, keeping me moving when my legs wanted to give out. Earl's voice cracked for the first time since he had begun speaking. We were 20 meters from safety when the second IED detonated. I saw the disturbed earth a fraction of a second before the blast. Try to turn, try to shield him with my body. When I woke up, my leg was gone and Vince was dying in my arms. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. His last words, Earl said softly, "You got me out, Compass. That is all that matters." He looked up at Daniel, at the 4 young warriors who represented everything he and Vince had fought to build. But it was not all that mattered. It was never all that mattered. Because I am still here, and he is not. And not a day goes by that I do not wonder if I could have done something different. Moved faster. Seen the signs sooner. Been better. Daniel reached across the table and gripped Earl's forearm, his hand covering the tattoo that bore Vince's initials. "Master Chief," he said, "you carried him 300 meters under fire. You shielded him with your own body. You did everything any operator could have done and more." He paused, his voice thick. Senior Chief Thibodeau knew that. That is why his last words were what they were. He was not just telling you that you got him out. He was telling you to stop blaming yourself. Earl stared at the younger man for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe that is what he meant." He picked up his coffee cup and took a sip, his hand steady despite the emotion that had cracked his voice moments before. "Maybe it is time I started listening." The sun had dropped below the treeline by the time Earl finished speaking. The diner had taken on the warm amber glow of early evening, the fluorescent lights mixing with the fading daylight to create something almost sacred. Mabel had long since stopped pretending to work, standing behind the counter with a dish towel pressed to her eyes. Daniel Reeves sat back in a booth, his coffee untouched and cold. He had listened to war stories before, had told a few of his own, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of what Earl Whitmore had shared. This was not a tale of glory or heroism. This was the raw, unvarnished truth of what service cost, laid bare by a man who had carried it alone for far too long. "Master Chief," Daniel said. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "I want you to know something. What you and Senior Chief Thibodeau built, it did not end in Ramadi. It lives on in every operator who has come through the teams since." Earl raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "The navigation techniques you developed," Daniel continued. "The way you taught men to read terrain, to trust their instincts, to find their way when every instrument failed. That is standard curriculum now. Every SEAL who has gone through BUD/S in the last 2 decades has learned your methods." Jensen nodded. "My father used to say that Compass could navigate by the smell of the wind. He made me memorize your principles before I ever set foot in Coronado. Said they would save my life someday." "And did they?" Earl asked. Jensen's jaw tightened. "Kandahar Province, 2018. Our GPS went down during a night extraction. Bad weather, 0 visibility, enemy contact on 3 sides." He paused. "I got my team out using nothing but the stars and the shape of the ridgeline. Exactly like my father taught me. Exactly like you taught him." Earl absorbed this in silence. The idea that his methods were still being passed down, still saving lives, still shaping operators decades after he had left the teams. It was more than he had ever expected, more than he felt he deserved. The third SEAL at the table, A compact man with a shaved head and watchful eyes spoke for the first time. "Name is Kowalski, Master Chief. I just wanted to say that I use your compass reading techniques every time I teach a new class. The instructors call it the Whitmore method now." Earl let out a breath that was almost a laugh. The Whitmore method. Vince would have gotten a kick out of that. He always said I was too stubborn to use a GPS like a normal person. The fourth SEAL, who had been silent throughout, leaned forward. His name tag read Torres, and his eyes held the particular intensity of a man who had seen things he would never speak about. "Master Chief," Torres said, "I served on a joint task force in Syria 3 years ago. There was a situation, a bad one, and we needed to extract through hostile territory with no support." He paused. "Our team leader quoted you the whole way. Said he had read your after-action reports from Panama, from Desert Storm, from missions that do not officially exist. Said if Compass could navigate a jungle blindfolded, we could find our way through a desert. And did you?" Torres allowed himself a small smile. "We did. 12 men, 40 kilometers, not a single casualty." He looked directly at Earl. "You saved our lives, Master Chief. You were not there, but you saved us all the same." Earl felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of a knot that had been tied for 18 years. He had spent so long focused on what he had lost, on the friend he could not save, on a life that had ended in a dusty street in Ramadi. He had forgotten to consider what he had built, what he had left behind, what continued to grow even in his absence. Mabel approached the table with a fresh pot of coffee and a plate piled high with pie. "Apple," she said. "My grandmother's recipe." She set it down in the center of the table. "For all of you. On the house." Daniel looked at the pie, then at Mabel. "Ma'am, you have already been more than generous." Mabel waved away his objection. "Young man, I have been serving travelers on this highway for 53 years. I have seen soldiers and sailors and airmen pass through these doors on their way to war and on their way home. I have seen families saying goodbye and families reuniting." She paused, her voice thickening. "But I have never seen anything like today. So you will eat my pie and you will not argue about it." The SEALs exchanged glances, then reached for forks with the disciplined efficiency of men who had learned never to refuse food when it was offered. Earl watched them eat, these young warriors who carried forward everything he and Vince had built. He thought about all the classes that had passed through BUD/S, all the operators who had learned his methods, all the lives that had been saved by techniques he had developed in jungles and deserts decades ago. Maybe Vince had been right. Maybe what they had built would outlast them both. "Master Chief," Daniel said between bites of pie, "I have to ask, what have you been doing since you left the teams?" Earl considered the question. "Living," he said finally. "Just living. Visiting Vince every Saturday. Coming to this diner where we used to stop together. Try to find some peace with what happened." Daniel set down his fork. "Have you found it?" Earl looked at the seat across from him, the seat that had been empty for 18 years and was now occupied by a young warrior who reminded him so much of himself at that age. "I think," he said slowly, "I might be getting closer." The police cruiser pulled into the parking lot just as the last slice of pie disappeared. The lights were off, no siren, just the quiet arrival of local law enforcement responding to a call that had been placed nearly an hour earlier. A deputy stepped out of the vehicle, a young man with a crisp uniform and the cautious posture of someone approaching an unknown situation. He paused to survey the parking lot, noting the absence of the motorcycles that had been reported, then pushed through the diner door. "Evening, folks." He touched the brim of his hat. "We got a call about some trouble with a motorcycle gang. Everyone all right in here?" Mabel stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron. "Everything is fine now, Deputy Warren. The troublemakers left about an hour ago." Deputy Warren's eyes swept the diner, taking in the scene. His gaze lingered on the 4 men with military haircuts, sharing a booth with an old man in a faded navy cap. Something about their posture, their bearing, made him straighten unconsciously. "Anyone hurt? Any property damage?" "No, sir," Mabel said. "Just some harsh words and bad behavior. But these gentlemen here handled it." The deputy approached the booth, his curiosity evident. "Handled it how, exactly?" Daniel rose from his seat and extended a hand. Senior Chief Daniel Reeves, United States Navy. My team and I happened to be here when a situation developed. We de-escalated, and the individuals in question chose to leave voluntarily. Deputy Warren shook the offered hand, his eyes widening slightly at the grip strength. Navy, he said. You boys stationed at Norfolk? Yes, sir. Heading back from a training exercise when we stopped for coffee. The deputy nodded. Then his attention shifted to Earl. And you, sir? I understand you were the primary target of the harassment. Earl looked up at the young lawman with calm, steady eyes. Just a misunderstanding, deputy. Some young men with more attitude than sense. It happens. Deputy Warren studied the old man for a long moment. The faded cap, the worn jacket, the prosthetic leg visible beneath the table. There was something about this man that demanded attention, a gravity that had nothing to do with age or infirmity. Sir, the deputy said carefully, I'm going to need to file a report. Would you mind giving me your name for the record? Earl Whitmore. The deputy's pen stopped moving. His head came up slowly, his eyes widening. Earl Whitmore, he repeated. Master Chief Earl Whitmore? Earl's brow furrowed. Do I know you, son? No, sir, but my grandfather did. Deputy Warren's voice had changed, taken on a quality of reverence that had not been there before. Lieutenant Commander James Warren. He served on the USS Midway, provided air support for several of your operations in the Gulf. Earl's expression softened. Jimmy Warren. I remember him. Good man. Good pilot. He got us out of a tight spot in Kuwait when our extraction went sideways. The deputy swallowed hard. He passed away 3 years ago. But he talked about you, sir. Talked about Compass. Said you were the best navigator he ever worked with, and that included his own flight crew. The diner had gone quiet again, the other patrons listening openly now. The elderly couple near the window exchanged knowing glances. The truckers at the counter had given up all pretense of minding their own business. Deputy Warren tucked his notepad back into his pocket. Master Chief, I'm not going to file a report on this. As far as I am concerned, nothing happened here today that requires police involvement. Daniel stepped forward. Deputy, we got photos of the license plates. Those men terrorized a family with small children and assaulted a decorated veteran. They should face consequences. The deputy considered this, then nodded. Send me what you have. I will make sure it gets to the right people. He turned back to Earl. And sir, if you ever need anything in this county, you let me know. My grandfather would haunt me for the rest of my life if I did not look out for one of his own. Earl allowed himself a small smile. Your grandfather was a good man, deputy. He raised a good family. The deputy touched his hat brim again, a gesture of respect that carried more weight than a salute. Gentlemen, Mung. He nodded to Mabel. You all have a good evening. He walked back to his cruiser with a different posture than when he had arrived, shoulders squared, chin up, as if the encounter had reminded him of something important about why he wore the badge. Daniel watched him go, then turned back to the table. Master Chief, I have been thinking. There is something I would like to do, if you would permit it. Earl raised an eyebrow. What is that? Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The teams have a newsletter. Internal distribution, but it reaches every active duty SEAL and most of the retired community. I would like to write about today. About you. About what happened here and what you shared with us. Earl shifted uncomfortably. I am not looking for attention, son. I know you are not. That is exactly why this story needs to be told. Daniel's voice was earnest. There are operators out there carrying the same weight you have been carrying. The same guilt, the same grief, the same belief that they failed when they did everything humanly possible. They need to hear your story. They need to know that even Compass struggled with this. Earl was silent for a long moment. Outside, the deputy's cruiser pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the gathering dusk. If you think it would help someone, Earl said finally. Then write it. Daniel nodded, something like relief crossing his features. Thank you, Master Chief. Earl picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down. Just do me one favor. Name it. Make sure you mention Vince. Earl's voice was quiet but firm. He deserves to be remembered too. Daniel's hand moved to his heart, a gesture of solemn promise. Senior Chief Vincent Michael Thibodeau. I will make sure everyone knows his name. 3 weeks later, Earl Whitmore stood before a familiar headstone in the Veterans Cemetery outside Richmond. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rows of white markers, and the grass beneath his feet was still wet with dew. He had made this walk 1,000 times, but today felt different. Today, he carried something other than grief. "Well, Vince," he said softly, "you're not going to believe what happened." He told the story from the beginning. The bikers in the parking lot, the confrontation in the diner, the 4 young SEALs who had stood up when it mattered. He told Vince about Daniel Reeves, about the Whitmore method, about all the lives that had been saved by techniques they had developed together in jungles and deserts decades ago. "They remember us, brother. They remember what we built." Earl's voice cracked slightly. "All those years I spent thinking I'd failed you, and the whole time, what we created was still out there, still growing, still saving lives." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. It had arrived 3 days ago, delivered by courier to his small house on the outskirts of Richmond. An official letter on Navy stationery, bearing a signature he had never expected to see. "They wanted to come back," he said. "Not for active duty, obviously, but they wanted to speak to the new class at BUD/S, share some stories. Remind those young men what they are training for." He paused, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Daniel Reeves made some calls. "Kid has got some pull, apparently." He refolded the letter and slipped it back into his pocket, next to the worn photograph that had lived there for 40 years. "I've been thinking about what you said to me that day," Earl continued. "You got me out, Compass. That is all that matters. For 18 years, I thought you were just being kind, telling me what I needed to hear, so I could keep going." He knelt down, his prosthetic leg creaking slightly, and placed his hand on the cool granite of the headstone. "But you were never one for empty words, were you? You meant exactly what you said. You were telling me that what mattered was the trying, the carrying, the refusing to give up even when everything was falling apart around us." He was quiet for a moment, listening to the wind move through the trees at the edge of the cemetery. "I think I finally understand, Vince. I think I'm finally ready to stop punishing myself for surviving." He rose slowly, his hand lingering on the headstone for a moment longer. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew something small. A blue crayon, worn down to a nub. The gift from a little girl who had seen a hero when everyone else saw a victim. He placed the crayon at the base of the headstone, next to the small American flag that the cemetery staff kept there year-round. "A little girl gave me that," he explained. "Her name was Emma. She said it was her favorite color and that maybe it would help." He smiled. "I think it did, brother. I think it did." He straightened his Navy cap, the same one that Cleatbrunner had knocked to the floor 3 weeks ago, the same one that Daniel Reeves had retrieved and returned with quiet dignity. "I will see you next Saturday, Vince. Same as always." He turned and walked back to his truck, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the path. But his shoulders were straighter than they had been in years, and his eyes held something that had been absent for a very long time. Hope. The following Saturday, Earl pulled into the parking lot of Mabel's Highway Diner and found a surprise waiting for him. Daniel Reeves sat on the hood of a pickup truck, 2 cups of coffee steaming in his hands. "Master Chief," Daniel said, extending one of the cups. "Thought you might want some company." Earl accepted the coffee and studied the younger man for a moment. "Do you not have somewhere else to be, Senior Chief?" Daniel shrugged. "Norfolk is not going anywhere. Besides, I figure we could continue our conversation from last time. You never did tell me about Panama." Earl looked at the diner, at the booth by the window where he had sat alone for 18 years. Then he looked at Daniel, at the earnest expression on the young warrior's face, at the genuine desire to learn and connect and carry forward the legacy of those who had come before. "All right," Earl said, "but you're buying lunch." They walked into the diner together, and Mabel's face lit up like a sunrise when she saw them. She already had the coffee pot in hand before they reached their booth. Earl slid into his usual seat, his back to the wall, his eyes on the door. But this time, the seat across from him was not empty. This time, a young SEAL with a gray-streaked beard settled into the cracked vinyl and leaned forward with eager attention. "Panama," Earl began. "December 1989. We were tasked with securing the airfield at Paytilla. And as the morning sun streamed through the windows of that roadside diner, two warriors from different generations shared coffee and stories, building a bridge between past and present that would carry forward into a future neither of them could see. Outside, the Virginia highway stretched toward the horizon, carrying travelers to destinations unknown. Some of them would pass this diner without stopping, never knowing what had happened within these walls. But others would stop, would hear Mabel's stories about the old veteran and the young SEALs, would look at the booth by the window and wonder about the men who had sat there. And somewhere, in a cemetery outside Richmond, a blue crayon rested against a headstone bearing the name Vincent Michael Thibodeau, a small token from a child who understood something that adults often forget, that heroes are not defined by the battles they win, but by the people they carry. If this story moved you today, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in the most unexpected places, we hope you will subscribe to our channel and join this community. And we would love to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell us about the quiet veteran in your life, the one who never talks about their service, but carries it with them every day. Because every person you pass on the street has a story. Some of them saved lives in places they will never speak about. Some of them carry brothers and sisters in their hearts who never made it home. And all of them deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching. And remember, the greatest heroes are often the ones who never ask to be recognized.